And again, remember that the purpose of all of this is to resist that which has happened and continues to happen by radical, worldly critics to the relation between the early post-structuralists and their more worldly orientation, to show that putting them into a binary opposition is fundamentally counterproductive. That we must see them as a continuity. Yes, post-structuralists failed, but not in the ultimate sense, insofar as they precipitated a way of understanding being which would allow for the perception of an ontological representation of being and a more political representation of being are continuous, not oppositional. So, in so many ways, from my own perspective, the most important thing, I think, is to remember that when we talk about being, we don't think of being independently of everything else in the world. This philosophical, highly ethereal concept of being that has no connection with the world. Being must be understood as that, and that whole series of relationalities, which I've been calling sites on a continuum, from the more abstract to the more worldly, from the ontological to the social and political. This is a continuity. And in between, include gender, race, and so on and so on and so forth. This is what's crucial. This is what we have to remember when the question of being comes up, and when the word being manifests itself in whatever you read. That's what you've got to think of. Of course, it's very difficult. Every good thinker will orient him or herself according to this question towards that aspect which imposes on his or her life. A woman is going to focus primarily, over-determine, using my language, over-determine the gender aspect of things. The worker is going to focus on the working class hierarchy, and so on and so forth. But what's crucial is that each one of these persons who is working within and over-determining what impinges on him or her must be aware of his or her relationship to all these others. That's the only way we're going to achieve any kind of solidarity to be able to resist the enormously difficult problem that poses to us by capitalist democracy. Okay, so let me go on. In modernity, according to Heidegger, the state of exception, according to Agamben, the state of exception, as in the case of Nazi Germany or the United States of the George W. Bush presidency, has become the rule. The rule has become the norm. That's, of course, a great paradox. But it's a paradox which has enormous consequences. Under its aegis, state of exception that have become the rule, the primary goal of political decision-making has become national security. That's why our discourse, without most people realizing what's really a state budget, that's why our media and our discourse at this particular moment is so saturated by the question of the issue of homeland security, the security state, the security state. What's crucial is our security. And if it takes the negation of our rights, our freedoms, that's okay, because what's more important is our security, that enemy out there. That's also fundamental to the idea of the normalization of the state of exception. Anything goes once you establish the state of exception as the norm. And as we've seen by way of the exposure by Snowden, we live in a security state in more than just an abstract way. We're being investigated every single day of our lives by our government, or even if we're not, we live as if we are, because we know that this is the case, that the American government has access to every single thought that we have in our heads. And this is what we have to realize when we talk about the normalization of the state of exception rendering secure our homeland, the idea of the homeland. At this paradoxical liminal point in the pursuit of its logic of belonging, the law, the human right to be, has been obliterated in the name of saving it. And the binary friend-foe logic, which Agamben, reading Carl Schmitt against himself, shows, is intrinsic to the exceptionless sovereign logos of metaphysical thinking, has become not simply biopolitics, the systematic reduction of human life to zero, but even farther at this liminal point. And this is what Agamben, in that passage that I read last time, is getting at. We've been for a long time now, a biopolitical society where biopolitics has penetrated and saturated our education system, our juridical system, and so on. But that's nothing compared to where we're going. We're going to the second phase of that, thanatopolitics, where you can kill with impunity, where what's crucial is the security of the state, and you can kill with impunity. We see this, and Agamben sees it, only because we've arrived already at that liminal point of the fulfillment of the logic of the security, the logic of security. Thus far, that's where we left off last time. Thus far, I have all too briefly summarized the major critical imperatives of Agamben's radicalization of Heidegger. Equally important, of the indissolubly related positive possibility. I've been talking mostly now about, but mostly up to this point, about how do we resist the normalization of the state of exception? What do we do? What are the possibilities of resistance? But Agamben has more to say than just resistance. He is talking about what are the alternatives? What kind of alternative polis, what kind of alternative community can we imagine on the basis of what we discovered about the community that we exist in? Following Heidegger's retrieval of temporality, the being of being as an ontological phenomenon, particularly particularly Walter Benjamin's time of the now, this is Agamben, moving from Heidegger's retrieval of temporality from teleological versions of it, metaphysical versions of it, and where he departs from Heidegger, or where he extends Heidegger by picking up on the potentialities in Heidegger's radical temporality as they are manifest in Walter Benjamin's concept of the now, the Jetztzeit. Following Heidegger's retrieval of temporality, the being of being is the ontological phenomenon, particularly Walter Benjamin's time of the now, from the oblivion to which the spatializing imperatives of metaphysics has relegated it. Agamben, like Arendt, and remarkably like Said, I want to insist, reads the post-World War II world as an interregnum, an in-between world, or, more precisely, the liminal point in the development of the logic of nation-state belonging that has precipitated for positive thought, the nothing, das Nichts. We've talked a lot about that in fact. That the modern world will, remember, I'm quoting Heidegger here, at all costs have nothing to do with, all across the continuum of being, from the ontological subjective to the more patently socio-political side. The nothing, which, to anticipate, and I don't think I have to do this by this time, is the ontological version of the unbreathable, the part of no part, the bare life, and so on and so forth, which we've seen is so fundamental to the which we are seeing is so fundamental to the post-structuralist thinkers. They're connecting the nothing that Heidegger discloses with the human nothings that are its equivalent at the level of polis. This is what I mean by why I think the importance, so that the polis, therefore, that is to come, is going to be a polis that will not produce or repeat the conditions that produce the human beings of the old dispensation, who automatically become fodder for becoming bare life again. And what of course is at stake is therefore that you begin in thinking the polis by way of taking the nothing as the primordial reality, and it's on the basis of the nothing that you build the coming human community, as we'll see. Not the human being, therefore, cannot be understood as having some kind of transcendental or essential identity. You can't think of human being in essentialist terms. The human being is open for all possibility, could become anything. It has no foundation, it has no identity. You can't talk about, as we have over the past several hundred years, humankind, kind as if that meant we are a category that can be identified in opposition to every other form of being. We cannot any longer think that. It is fraught with potential for disaster, but also for promise too. The consequence of this liberation of the polyvalent, and I call it always a polyvalent nothing, not only ontological, but it's also gender, race, social, political, cultural, etc., etc. The consequence of this liberation of the polyvalent nothing and its now time, it also affects on the continual being time. Time now is a now time as opposed to a teleological time, which is informed by principle of present. By the eventual self-destruction of the teleological spatial time of anthropological modernity and its means and its logic. Let me read that over again. The consequence of this liberation of the polyvalent nothing and its now time, precipitated by the eventual self-destruction of the teleological spatialized time of anthropological modernity and its means and logic, is that potentiality as such has been liberated from its bondage to the act, the higher cause. Potentiality as such, that's what gets released. That gets living no more. In this new dispensation, the ethical imperative, the human vocation, becomes the Agamben's very now, at least in this class, famous phrase, revocation of every vocation. That's the human vocation. To revoke every vocation. To revoke every vocation. That is, the retrieval of the in-between time of the now renders the sovereign law, its promised fulfillment structure, its binary logic of belonging that represents the being of being as nothing, the uncounted, the superfluous, the ungrievable, the part of no part, and the operation of the vocational ethos inoperative. Renders them inoperative. Another key word of Agamben's writing. Taking his point of departure, and here we're going to talk about Agamben's book on St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. Taking his point of departure from the Jew-Greek Gentile opposition in the time of St. Paul. That was the main binary opposition, Jew versus Greek, at least for St. Paul. As far as area, spaces of belonging is concerned. You were either a Jew or you were a Gentile. You were either a Gentile or you were a Jew. Greek, i.e. Gentile. Taking the point of departure from the Jew/Greek opposition that is the heart of his radically revisionary reading of the Apostle Paul's account of his eventual messianic calling. He was called. He puts it that way. He was called. In the letter to the Romans, Agamben writes, I'll read this slowly. According to the apostle, and of course, Agamben, and here, by the way, it is not accidental that Badiou also has a book on St. Paul, a reading of St. Paul, epistles more generally, St. Paul's epistle, in which although there are certain tensions between Agamben and Badiou, fundamentally the same. What they're trying to do is to show that the whole Christian tradition is based on a total misreading of St. Paul. Again, that's obviously very controversial. But it's something, the power of their analysis is so strong, is so persuasive that we have to put it into context when we make our decision about Christianity, whatever. For them, St. Paul was a very radical thinker, and not one who had in mind the envisioning of a Christian church which would eventually dominate the world. That was farthest from his mind, as Agamben and Badiou will say. Anyway, this is the quote from Agamben. According to the apostle, this movement of the calling, in Paul the word is klesis, and it saturates his discourse. But, of course, it means exactly the opposite of what has come to mean in the Western tradition. And in the sense that I've been criticizing that term, calling. According to the apostle, this movement of the calling, klesis, is above all a nullification. Quote from Paul. Circumcision, by which he means it's a synecdoche for being a Jew. Circumcision is nothing, and the foreskin, which is the synecdoche of being a Gentile or Greek, is nothing. Those are Paul's terms. Doesn't matter whether you're a Jew or a Gentile. They're nothing. That which, according to the law, made one man a Jew and the other a Goy, this is Agamben, one a slave and another a free man, is now annulled by the vocation. What remains in this nothing? Once again, menito, remaining, does not convey indifference. It signifies the immobile, anaphoric gesture of the messianic calling, as being essential and foremost a calling of the calling. it deconstructs the calling and its imperatives, which you must serve. It is deconstructing the demands of servitude, which is intrinsic to the idea of calling that comes from any teleological system, any teleological concept of time. Once again, Benito remaining, the title of Agamben's book is The Time That Remains, and that word remain is very important. It's the remainder once the teleological system has been deconstructed. What remains? And of course that is the time of the now. That's the remainder, which we must think and think positively. It signifies the immobile and anaphoric gesture of the messianic calling. Its being essentially and foremost a calling of the calling. For this reason, it may apply revocation of vocation, calling of the calling. For this reason, it may apply to any condition, but for the same reason, it revokes a condition and radically puts it into question. In the very act of adhering to it, you see, therefore, what he means by rendering inoperative. Greek, you can be Greek, you can be Jew, you can be this, you can be that. And you go on being that after you've undertaken the process of rendering inoperative, revoking the vocation. They don't matter anymore. The old structure of, obviously, of friend and foe, of death, of war to the end, is no longer applicable. That's a crucial point of this. You remain a Jew, you remain a Greek, you remain a woman, you remain a man, you remain this, you remain that. But the old terms no longer apply, no longer work. They're rendered inoperative. And we'll see what that entails later on. But for the moment, let's just leave it at that. The vocation intrinsic to the metaphysical tradition, as we have seen, alienates humans from the time of the now, or min kerot. That, by the way, is Paul's phrase. The interesse, the in-between, the being in the midst, that precipitates interest, care. The interesse of its occasion that generates engaged interest or care. The difference, the way I like to put it, the difference, that ultimate difference that makes us feel the difference in the world. Difference that makes a difference. If we didn't have that difference, that radical difference, which is prior to identity, then we wouldn't be interested in the world. We wouldn't be engaged by the world. It's that difference that makes a difference. We get bored by the same, to put it simply. We get bored by the same. And boredom is a very, very important, crucial term in literary studies, literary production, particularly in the modern and postmodern world. And also in discoursive philosophy. Heidegger, Agamben, Derrida, everyone has written on this question of boredom. Why? Because boredom is a precondition for the reduction of life to bare life. Boredom is a condition of indifference that renders the body susceptible to being reduced biopolitically to bare life. One of the most important writers, postmodern writers, on the question of boredom is Samuel Beckett. Over and over and over again, the notion of boredom, crucial, among many others. But I suggest him as a synecdoche of the rest of it. This for vocation intrinsic to the metaphysical tradition orients the human towards a future telos, and in so doing reduces its polyvalent potentiality to a fixed identity, its relation to the phenomena it encounters in terms of the binary friend-foe logic, Jew versus Greek, in the above passage, and its practice to undeviating servitude to the higher cause. The eventual vocation Agamben derives from Paul, on the other hand, entails, quote, the revocation of every vocation. In taking as directed from the time of the now, it does not obliterate the law. It renders it kataryin. Kat, that's the Paul's word. Kataryin. Inoperative. Kata, in, aryin, operative. More on this in a minute. That is, the law's promised fulfillment structure, its means and economy, and its binary friend-foe logic remain intact. But they no longer work in the invisible and polyvalently deadly way they did under the aegis of the law. In this new dispensation, in short, the Jew becomes a non-Jewish Jew. Remember we talked about Hannah Arendt as being a non-Jewish Jew on the basis of Edward Said's reference to I forget his name, the Jewish writer who wrote a book called The Non-Jewish Jew, and on the basis of that identified himself, Said himself, as non-human human, and by extension we saw a non-Palestinian, a non-Jewish Jew. In short, the Jew becomes a non-Jewish Jew, and the Greek or Gentile becomes a non-Greek Greek, or a non-Gentile Gentile. That is to say, they become exilic figures who, as such, outside, inside. I'm outside and inside, that's what it is to be a non-Jewish Jew. I'm outside and inside, or in Hannah Arendt's term, a conscious pariah. Remember that. And obviously, I'm invoking this inside, insider to recall our discussion of Said's fundamental point of departure in terms of his commitment to the exilic consciousness. Exilic figures who, as such, outside insiders of the homeland, have no longer any reason unanswerable to the inexorable imperatives of the logic of belonging of the dominant cultures, and thus can, to recall Erucai's gloss on Adorno, Bartlebian insight into the new anti-identitarian mode of resistance precipitated by the self-destruction of the nation-state imperial party, call the hierarchy directly by its name. He becomes a Adornian figure, or he becomes, in this dispensation, the Jew, Gentile, a Bartlebian figure who is enabled to refuse to be answerable to what? The call. As in the case of Bartleby's refusal to answer, I prefer not to, the call of the higher cause, which in that story is, of course, the Wall Street lawyer. The passage that I quoted was from Adorno, Said's a quotation from Adorno. Can, in that condition of the exilic outsider answer, he can call the hierarchy directly by its name, meaning as a apparatus of capture, as a mode of a way of dominating those who have been called. It is, in fact, this new Bartlebian mode of resistance, the possibility precipitated by the emergence of the unhomed emigre, Said, or refugee, Aaron, and the presiding figure of the post-World War II global interregnum, that Agamben, though his example is the contemporary capitalist, communist Chinese hierarchy, is attempting to think by way of the coming to be of the singular and unnameable whatever being in the coming community. That's his version, that's his positive version of bare life. I quote this symptomatic reading of Tiananmen Square. This is from the end of the coming community by Agamben. I quote this symptomatic reading of Tiananmen Square by Agamben at length, not only to demonstrate the affiliative relationship between Agamben's whatever being and Bartleby's I would prefer not to. You remember I said, and you read Coming Community, you'll see there's a chapter entitled Bartleby to indicate that he's a presence throughout that whole book, and precisely in the way that I've indicated in the last few minutes. Between Agamben's whatever being and Bartleby's I would prefer not to, but also to underscore the remarkable parallel between the new mode of political resistance he envisages as adequate to the conditions of the demographic conditions of the interregnum, and that Said envisages, and that envisaged by Said in the way of the self-destruction of the nation-state system and its imperial project, and passage from the end of cultural imperialism we spent a lot of time talking about. This is Agamben. What could be the politics of whatever singularity? This human being now understood as whatever being could be anything, because he has no identity, no essential identity. What could be the politics of whatever singularity that is of a being whose community is mediated not by any condition of belonging, being red, a communist, being Italian, being a communist, nor by the simple absence of conditions, a negative community such as that recently proposed by Maurice Blanchot, but by belonging itself, just the idea of belonging. A herald from Beijing carries the elements of response. And he's now going to talk about what happened in Tiananmen Square as he sees it. What was most striking about the demonstrations of the Chinese May was the relative absence of determinate contents in their demands. Democracy and freedom are notions too general and broadly defined to constitute the real object of conflict. And the only concrete demand, the rehabilitation of Ho Yao Ban, was immediately granted by the. To say with democracy, they wanted democracy, it was so phenomenally general that it couldn't mean anything. So you cannot, as of course every democratic society, particularly in the United States, cannot say, as the American pundits, the media, the government of the United States see, those people in China want democracy, American-style democracy. That is not what they wanted, at least as Agamben very forcefully puts it. And as I think the conditions in China make it quite clear. What was most striking about the demonstration of Chinese May was the relative absence of determinate contents in their demands. Democracy and freedom are notions too generally and broadly defined to constitute the real object of conflict. This makes the violence of the state's reaction seem even more inexplicable, and the violence of the reaction was very violent. It is likely, however, that the disproportion of violence is only apparent, and that the Chinese leader acted, from their point of view, with great lucidity. They knew, meaning better than, say, Americans know, who interpreted the event the way they did. With greater lucidity than the Western observers, who were exclusively concerned with advancing increasingly less plausible arguments about the opposition between democracy and communism. The novelty, he emphasized, of the coming politics is that it will no longer be a struggle for the conquest of control of the state of the capital level, but a struggle between the state and the non-state, which means, of course, humanity. With humanity, that's the struggle of coming from. The state is a system that identifies the human community, gives it a name, gives it an identity, reduces its potential according to the imperatives demanded by the state as a higher cause. The novelty of the coming community is that it will no longer be a struggle for the conquest or control of the state, but a struggle between the state and the non-state, humanity. An insurmountable disjunction between whatever singularity, whatever being, and the state organization and its ordering imperative. It's identifying and ordering imperative. This has nothing to do with this is still Agamben, This has nothing to do with the simple affirmation of the social opposition to the state and that has often found expression in the protest movements of recent years. This is, according to Agamben, something radically different. Whatever singularities cannot form a societas, a community in the traditional sense of the word, because they do not possess any identity to vindicate red, Italian, Greek, Jew, and so on and so on. They have no identity to vindicate, to protect, to secure, nor any bond of belonging for which to seek recognition. I am a Greek, I am a Jew, I am a woman, I am a male, and so on and so on. That's what's radically new about whatever human being, who is the remainder of the self-destruction of teleological conflict in time. In the final instant, he goes on, the state, capital L, can recognize any claim for identity, even that of a state identity within the state. The recent history of relations between the state and terrorism is an eloquent confirmation of this fact. What the state cannot, it can tolerate a lot, what the state cannot tolerate in any way, however, is that the singularities form a community without affirming an identity. That's when the state goes haywire. That's when the state has to rush in and stop. What the state, I'm going to read that again, what the state cannot tolerate in any way, however, is that the singularities form a community without affirming an identity, that humans co-belong without any representable condition of belonging, even in the form of a simple proposition, presupposition. They co-belong without, at the same time, imposing an identity on that co-belonging. The state, as Alain Badiou has shown, is not founded on a social of which it would be the expression, a social bond of which it would be the expression, but rather on the dissolution, the unbinding it prohibits. For the state, therefore, in other words, the state has its raison d'etre in asserting and in imposing a principle of identity on all human beings. That is raison d'etre. If it cannot do that, it cannot exist. So it has to do that in order to survive. For the state, therefore, what is important is never the singularity as such, but only its inclusion in some identity. Whatever identity, but the possibility of that whatever itself being taken up without an identity is a threat the state cannot come to terms with. A being radically devoid of a representable identity would be absolutely irrelevant to the state. This is what, in our culture, the hypocritical dogma of the sacredness of human life and the vacuous declaration of human rights are meant to hide. Sacredness here can only mean what the term meant in Roman law. Sacre was one who had been excluded from the human world, and who, even though she or he could not be sacrificed, could be killed without committing homicide. It is significant, Agamben adds, from this perspective, that the extermination of the Jews was not conceived as homicide, neither by the executioners nor the judges. Rather, the judges presented it as a crime against humanity. The victorious powers tried to compensate for the lack of identity with a concession of a state identity, which itself became the source of new massacres, talking about the Western world's creation of Palestine for the Jews at the expense of the Palestinians. That's an aside that whatever singularity which wants to appropriate belongingness itself as like potentiality as such, without identity, without act, its own being in language, whatever singularity which wants to appropriate belonging in itself, its own being in language, and thus rejects all identity and every condition of belonging, is the principal enemy of the state. Wherever these singularities peacefully demonstrate their being in common, there will be a Tiananmen Square. And sooner or later, the tanks will appear. That's what the state cannot tolerate. And if we have a little enough time, I would give a more recent example of Tiananmen Square at Tahrir Square in Egypt, and what has happened since then. But I would also want to add that Tahrir Square, what happened in Tahrir Square, is not over yet. The state has really come down, the military state has really come down with a vengeance on the people in order to secure the identity it needs to maintain its authority. But it's been a year now, and that rumbling of the people of humanity is still operative. They have not been succeeding in doing so. And every symptom that this government is cracking. So it's not over yet. So that Agamben's analysis and diagnosis of Tiananmen Square is still quite reliable. And of course, my concluding comments about Agamben's analysis of Tiananmen Square is that when he says Beijing is a harbinger of what is to come, you could also say that Bartleby, or reference to Bartleby, is a harbinger to come because it is the part of being I prefer not to respond to your calling that renders inoperative, renders the state inoperative, or produces the conditions which enables the rendering of that state inoperative. This is why it's amazing that an American writer in the 19th century would have such enormous influence in what's going on in the world today. That's one of the things that is astonishing about Melrose Square. And of course, I would also want to say that Bartleby, the Scrivener, his story, 10, 15-page story, 20-page story, is not an accident in Melville's work. It epitomized everything that Melville wrote from the time of Moby Dick on, through Pierre, through The Confidence Man, through Israel Potter, Benito Cereno, and so on and so forth. It's there in a fundamental way, presence in all of that writing. In Culture and Imperialism, Said's Culture and Imperialism, it will be recalled, Said, having borne witness to the demise of the Western imperial project and its logic of belonging, perceived its multitudinous victims as constituting the basis of a new mode of resistance adequate to the descended global condition of the interregnum. Quote, remember, it is no exaggeration to say that liberation as an intellectual mission born in the resistance and opposition to the confinements or ravages of imperialism has now shifted from the settled, established, and domestic dynamics of culture to its unhoused, decentered, and exilic energies whose incarnation today is the migrant and whose consciousness is the intellectual and artist in exile. The political figure between domains, between forms, between homes, and between languages. In a remarkably similar way, Agamben too recognizes that resistance in the deracinated global era can no longer take the form demanded by the identity logic intrinsic to the nation state. Seen from this alienated perspective, his whatever beings, qualunque, his Latin term, his technical term, the identity-less identities, they are, when I refer to the Jew as non-Jewish Jew, the Greek as non-Greek Greek, the non-Gentile Gentile, the non-Palestinian Palestinian. I'm really referring, the term that encapsulates all of these identities is encapsulated in the term an identity-less identity. They have identity, but they're identity-less. Identity-less identity. The identity-less identities to whom the interregnum has returned the linguistic being they were denied by spectacular identity, the spectacular identity logic of belonging of the nations of the earth, become paradoxically precisely as the expressive, uncounted, and inarticulate, like Said's unhomed borrowed being energies, the principal, Agamben's term, principal enemies of the state. But Agamben's insight into the revolutionary implications of the interregnum, the self-destruction of the logic of the nation-state, of nation-state belonging, and the precipitation of the refugee as his defining figure, is not limited to this new mode of Bartlebian resistance against a world structured in domination, whether Chinese capitalist communism or American democratic capitalist communism. It also entails, again, like Said's insight into the political potential inherent in the émigré, the envisioning of an alternative polis. It's not a matter of resistance, potential for resistance, but also for a potential new coming community. And by the way, I should say, just to make this clear from the beginning, the concept of coming community, title Agamben, the coming community, does not mean, you should not read that to mean some community that's eventually is going to come. That's not what I mean. The term coming implies always already. So this coming community is going to be coming always already. No. That's going to come to an end. Something is going to come to an end, which of course is fundamental to the community as it's understood according to the dictates, imperatives of the logic of the nation state. That's fundamental, that's crucial. It's always open-ended. It's always full of potentiality as such. In the passage from the cultural imperialism, quoted at the beginning, I've already quoted, Said, it will be recalled, asserts that the alienated exilic perspective of the interregnum not only announces a radically new form of resistance, but also, and no doubt with the question of Palestine in mind, a radically new idea of the community, of the human community, using the language of music as his model. That's interesting too. Said will attempt to create, and he did this in the latter part of his life, attempt to create a language from a different model than the spatializing language that we've seen pervades the language of Western civilization. That spatializing language, the language which privileges the eye. Said is invoking a language that now privileges hearing, sound. And as I just said, he experimented, he played with, he meditated on the potentialities of musical sound as the point of departure for creating a language of words, but now oriented not by sight, but by hearing, which I don't want to go into this. This is an enormously complex issue raised by Derrida and the deconstructionists, who I think wrongly said that the point of departure of Western civilization and language understood in and by Western civilization had its origin in sound, in hearing, in the privileging of hearing by Plato. When you hear something, I don't want to go into it, it's too complicated, but when you hear something, you as someone that receives that, takes it in as something that's self-identical and renders you self-identical. Whereas writing, see, the ocular and the writing, well, writing, which is what Derrida privileges, when, in other words, sound, hearing, and the sense of self of the hearer, one who takes in what you hear, become identical. Whereas writing, once it's written, is out there, open for anyone to read as he or she wishes. It becomes, therefore, undecidable. I'm thinking of hearing, and Agamben is thinking of hearing, as the opposite of that. Absolutely opposite of that. I can't go into it, too complicated. But anyway, I hope that I've said enough to indicate the direction which I would take that opposition if we were to pursue it further. And I'm saying that this is why Said is meditating in his late work, or from the point of culture and imperialism on, meditating on the potentiality for an alternative language implicit in particularly, Said is a little bit more specific than what I've said so far, sound, a particular form of music, and that is contrapuntal music, where two motifs are two different motifs are at play with each other, contradicting each other always already, and then at best never arriving at any kind of resolution between one voice and the other. He's trying to imagine a language which would be the equivalent of that fundamental aspect of contrapuntal music. You can see, therefore, why the notion of potentiality, openness, as opposed to closeness, is crucial to this potential orientation. In the passage from Culture and Imperialism quoted at the beginning of this essay, Said, it will be recalled, asserts that the alienated, exilic perspective of the interregnum not only announces a radically new form of resistance, but also, and no doubt with the question of Palestine in mind, a radically new idea of the human community using the language of music as its model. Quote, from this perspective also, one can see the whole concert dancing together contrapuntally. That phrase, I don't think I've mentioned this before, ma'am. That phrase is a very curious paradox, contains a very curious paradox. In what sense? That you notice that the complete concert dancing together is in small codes, comes from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, which is at least on the surface, a Christian poem about the Christian dispensation. The complete concert dancing together, but then he adds contrapuntal. And we wonder, what the hell does that mean? This invocation of T.S. Eliot's great Christian poem, major poem, his last faith, and then adding contrapuntal. What does that mean? I have addressed elsewhere and at length the question of the political meaning of this resonantly enigmatic phrase, which had taken the form of a discordia concourse. That phrase, discordia concourse, of course, comes from from Samuel Johnson's very, very famous criticism of metaphysical poetry, John Donne, Herbert, so on and so forth. When I was an undergrad, when I was a graduate student, that phrase was like, you know, a phrase that every graduate student had on the tip of his tongue and used a million times. It's so bizarre. Anyway, I love the phrase. And of course, Johnson, being an 18th century, couldn't abide what these metaphysical thoughts were doing. Couldn't abide that. And so he gave them this negative, connotative phrase. Their poetry is discordia concourse, with the emphasis on the discord. Anyway, which, in taking the form of a discordia concourse, a discord which is given concordance, a yoking by violence, a line from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. That's also Samuel Johnson's thesis. That poetry is yoked by violence, disparate things, you know. And if you know Donne's poetry, that's what he's all about. Yoking by violence, a line from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, an ostensibly Christian poem modeled on the tonality of the sonata form. And you know, if you know Four Quartets, you know that it's written on the basis of musical metaphor. But his orientation is tonal, so that in the end, the four quartets resolve themselves according to the tonal key that runs through all of them. So that would suggest that discordia concourse, the whole concept dancing together contrapuntively means for Said an atonal orientation towards music rather than tonal. An ostensibly Christian poem modeled on the tonality of the sonata form, with a word from the domain of musical counterpoint that is seemingly antithetical. Here, therefore, I will take, for the sake of convenient brevity, quote a passage, quote a summary statement of the argument that I made somewhere else. It would be the character of a polity envisaged as the complete concert dancing together. What would be the character of a polity envisaged as the complete concert dancing together contrapuntively? If you're going to understand what Said means by that, the first thing you have to do is hear this enormous pause between the quotation of Eliot and the word contrapuntal. Like, the way I would read it, the complete concert dancing together, contrapuntal, to emphasize that tension. Taking one's directive from what has been disclosed by Said's account of the intellectual in exile and artist in exile, one is enabled to see at the outset that such a polity or world would be radically different from the world fabricated according to the logic of the modern Western nation state. The world of the latter, of the nation state, as the exilic consciousness bears witness, is a world whose inclusive exclusive biopolitical logic of belonging is intended to render nativity, territory, and citizenship. Those are the three terms that Agamben, borrowing from Hannah Arendt in Origins of Totalitarianism, uses to characterize the kind of belonging that's fundamental to the nation state. Nativity, territory, and citizenship. An identical and harmonious unit, a complete concert, as it were, that derives its power from drawing borders with its others, us and them, in Said's ubiquitous phrase, or friend and foe, in which the powerless latter, the foe, the end, the them, are necessarily dehumanized, rendered non-being, and their spaces a no space, terra nullius, begging occupation and improvement. Begging occupation, improvement says, well, we want you to come and colonize it. We're so stupid, we can't do this on our own. On that. Which, I'm not exaggerating, is fundamental to, going all the way back to the idea, an 19th century idea, Western idea of white man's burden. White man's burden. We don't want to do this, but they're begging us to do it, and for the sake of their humanity, we have to do it whether we want to or not. You know that. The polity implied by Said's musical metaphor, on the other hand, would emerge from the radically unhomed and defamiliarized, destructured world, from, more specifically, the rubble of the denationalized world of the Western nation state, in which everything and everyone is therefore singular, unreproducible. We're all, this is what Agamben means by whatever being. We're singularity. And I would say that term, singular, identifying humans as singular, is a term that is used by all these post-structuralists. Said's term in this same passage is counter, original, spare, strange. This is not to say that such a new and a strange space where everything has been defamiliarized and the notion of family relations no longer applies, would annul the cultural identities of those who inhabit it. As opposed to their ontological origin under the aegis of the nation state, it would rather render them conscious of their historical origins, their constructedness, as opposed to the naturalness attributed to them by the nation state, the natal relationship with the nation state. To return to the specific case of Palestine, the Palestinians would remain Palestinians, and the Jews would remain Jews. I'm still quoting that passage, summary passage about Said. But like the Jew who becomes a non-Jewish Jew, and a Palestinian who becomes a non-Palestinian Palestinian in the in-between of pariahdom or exile, the murderous binary, stripped of its essentialist ontological or sacred ground, would, to use the resonantly appropriate term from Giorgio Agamben I invoked earlier, not only becomes inoperative, inoperacita, but also unendingly creative. What was friend and foe remains antagonistic. But where the relationship has been friend and foe, where one side was the object of the other's hatred and will to destroy, becomes dialectical, open-ended, creative, open-ended. An open-ended dialectic means, Agamben's term, without end, i.e. a beginning that always already mutually deepens both sides of that opposition. Opposition remains, but now it becomes, to anticipate, a loving strife, a playful strife, which deepens each rather than annuls each's other constructed identity. The coming community, and I finished that summary passage. The coming community, oh, our time is up. Okay, well, we'll go on to